Hey TCRC, back with another video. This is a follow-up really on the one I did, the first one I did, the one from last week on overfunctioning and underfunctioning. I'm hoping these are valuable or worthwhile learning opportunities for you, as this whole concept, I guess, has been about learning for me as well. So last video was about how proper functioning, and I'm talking particularly about the church, how proper functioning is really about recognizing healthy, balanced boundaries and responsibilities. So today I want to reflect a little bit on the theology that could be behind it. It's not always the case. So when I'm over functioning, theologically, I could be described as being caught up in a savior or hero complex. At some level, I am acting like the church's well-being and very survival depend only on me. It's a trap that a lot of church leaders and particularly pastors can fall into without even maybe recognizing themselves that they're there. So thinking that the survival of the church depends only on me, and in that thinking, I am in my subconscious mind nobly sacrificing for her survival. That's not really the case theologically. There's only one Savior. It's not you. But it is the story such folk tell themselves. Many pastors overfunction in that way, with that mindset. And many churches welcome that overfunctioning. And then it becomes part of the culture, and the congregation begins to expect it as standard operating procedure. I remember learning about a church that had a story about a previous pastor who was great at visiting. And so that was his reputation decades later. Oh yeah, so-and-so was just great at visiting. And I'm combining two stories here really. One aspect of that in one story was that this pastor made a habit of, once people turned, I forget what the age was, let's say 65, he would make sure he came and had coffee with them every birthday they had after that. Great at visiting. And the other story, which is similar, is of when I asked about that pastor that had this reputation for being good at visiting, it turned out, I said, how did a visit go, to somebody who had experienced it? And this lady said, well, he would come to the front door and he would stop and chat with whoever was in the living room on the way in. And then he'd come into the kitchen and he'd sample the soup I was making and talk to me for a little bit. And then maybe talk to the kids who were doing their homework at the kitchen table. And he'd go out the back door and maybe say something to the kids that were in the backyard. And then he'd be gone. And I said, wow, and this was depicted as a great visit. So I asked, how long did that take? And she said, 10, 12 minutes. It wouldn't fit the definition of great visiting in my books. And what both of these situations that I've heard about from the past created was an expectation that the next pastor would be like that. And especially if a couple of those kinds of things accumulate in a congregation, a lot of pastors will, when they're considering a call, will be asking around, looking for signs of a previously over-functioning pastor that wasn't identified as such. Because it's a fool's errand to follow a situation like that. Okay, I got off my notes here. When I am underfunctioning theologically, I tend to be driven by a helplessness that has no salvation in the picture, a kind of a glass half empty focus. I tend to see myself in that underfunctioning as a victim, also a theological category, and as insufficient. Not quite, well, theologically that could be the case as well, but just insufficient. And I can't or won't see a way of doing things differently. I can't get creative to get out of that way of thinking. Yeah, we do say that we are to let go and let God, but that does not mean that we are passive and underactive. There's a balance to be found where God is in the driver's seat of salvation of souls and churches, and we are doing our part, but not as if success is only possible based on our action. So this creates this pattern of overfunctioning, underfunctioning, with its theological underpinnings, can create patterns and challenges, particularly challenges in churches. Physical and psychological toes get stepped on when there is serious overfunctioning in a church. The overfunctioning individuals, often pastors and other key leaders, sometimes the custodian, also begin to suffer burnout. Hopefully they recognize it, but often they don't. And they might become resentful of all of those who are not pulling their weight. And so in one situation, I ran into that. And this gentleman that said that, or something similar to that to me, actually he would let his wife express that. I don't think he said it to me himself in person. But he did so much for the church. He was often there midweek fixing a toilet. There was some trouble with the septic system. There was a church with a septic system. Anyway, he'd be there during the week doing things, and he made a point of being there. There was a preschool that used the facility as an independent contract, and in the hope of making connections with young parents from the neighborhood, he would try to be there every time the kids were dropped off, just saying hello. He did a lot. No one could beat his sweat equity that he put into the church, but he had this grudge about the people that weren't pulling their weight. And so the spiritual and relational health of a congregation, when that's beginning to happen, freezes, it halts at a certain level, and even begins to decline. Overfunctioning folks stick their noses deeply into decision-making processes that are not their responsibility. Note, that's the key part, that they're not their responsibility. And those making that decision start to interpret that as a lack of trust, right? If you hear that someone who has no role to play in a particular decision is agitating about that decision, or talking to as many people as they can about how they disagree with that decision, there's something not healthy there, especially if they're not communicating that to the proper people who are responsible for the decision. And so there's a trust breakdown in that. Overfunctioners also tend to just do things without consulting others who they really should check with. So lots might be happening in a church like that if you've got a couple of overfunctioners, especially if they get competitive with each other. And but there's not much of a collectively identified motivation to it. So in the example I gave, the man might come in and realize one of the toilets isn't flushing properly and might fix it, but later you find out that the Building and Grounds Committee has a plan to fix it. So that's stepping in where it wasn't their responsibility. So in that kind of dynamic, those inclined to underfunctioning, and by the way, if you are inclined to underfunctioning, and I've said I have areas where I underfunction, but that underfunctioning gets encouraged by having lots of overfunctioners around. So those inclined to underfunctioning in a situation like I'm describing, they get to be bewildered and they try to stay out of the way of all those overfunctioners. And they might just give up on trying to do anything because they feel reprimanded or micromanaged when they try to take some responsibility. An example of this was in a church, a small congregation, where there were at least two of these kinds of overfunctioners, and they were slightly competitive to each other. And it was actually two couples that were in that situation. And there was a very deep need to have people help with the Sunday school. I believe they did the Sunday school during the sermon. And they could not get volunteers. So this was a kind of a standard complaint by this one couple. Nobody will help us. Nobody, people don't have a proper sense of needing to educate the kids. And particularly they would complain about the young adults not stepping up. So I went to the young adults and asked them what's going on here. Why are you not stepping up for this? And then they told me about how when they had tried in the past, they were told they were doing it all wrong. They were consistently corrected. And so there was no joy in it at all because of the micromanaging, overfunctioning that was going on. So that will happen as well. The overfunctioners will, by their behavior, begin to exclude other people from even trying, and then they become underfunctioners. In that particular situation, the young adults didn't leave the church. They just stuck with being on worship teams because neither of the overfunctioning couples were involved with the worship teams. So they could do their thing without interference. Anyway, those are examples of how it works. And so the underfunctioners, or those kind of forced into underfunctioning, might become resentful as well. And so now you've got two parties that are resentful of each other. Clashes of overfunctioners might lead to lingering conflict and resignations. I have other stories there, but I'm not going to make this long. Lack of clear boundaries about who's responsible for what, and lack of allowing them to actually be responsible can also cause people to step down, and so on. Let's say someone has been given the role of shoveling the snow on Sunday morning when it snows, the sidewalks. And consistently someone else arrives, someone who should know this has been appointed to someone, and shovels the snow. Well, how's the person who it's been appointed to going to receive that? So this is a difficult dynamic to challenge, and it's difficult to identify if you are in one of the extremes or not. And so I want to tell you that if you're working hard, contributing to the church, and you're enjoying it, and you're not feeling resentments about the work or about those who should be helping you, you are probably okay. Unless you catch yourself positively believing that you're the one that's called to save the church. Then you've got some work to do, most likely. The church has just one Savior, and it is not you. Solutions up to this. Solutions begin when everyone learns to be more self-aware of how they function. A more practical solution comes from very clearly and carefully defining role boundaries. Another comes from learning about emotional boundaries and the value of them and how to support them and reinforce them. Another comes from learning to ask yourself some questions like, why am I doing this? Why am I involved? Is it really my responsibility? Like, really? Or has it been assigned to somebody else? Can and ought it be delegated to someone else? In other words, if I have back trouble and I find myself mowing the lawn of the church or shoveling the snow, there's a space for me to think about why am I doing this? And then another good question is, how much do I enjoy the martyr aspect of overfunctioning? Or, on the other hand, the oh, I'm not responsible aspect of underfunctioning. And then I would say one last thing beyond that is, if you become a community that can have open conversations about that, where your relationships are strong enough that you could say to somebody, I don't know, that looked like overfunctioning to me, or that looked like underfunctioning to me. Could that be accurate, or however you would want to bring it up? That also strengthens the community. So that's a bit about the theological underpinnings that can happen in over and underfunctioning, and then also some dynamics that illustrate it and some solutions that can be taken to it. I appreciate if you have listened this whole way through.